Stephanie Ng, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Coach Ed.
I love that you still call me that.
I love it. It always brings me back to the days when I was a teenager.
Okay, let's have some
best.
context here. Like, our relationship. Where did it start, Steph?
I think I found Coastal because I was at a warrior class, and I was. Sorry.
Warrior was a gym that we used to share the space with. So you basically came to our competitors.
Yes.
They weren't our competitors. They're our partners. They're great people. Continue.
Yes, and so I was doing a class there, and then I think Bratsy showed up at the front desk, and then he was like, "Oh, come through and take a look at." I saw people doing really cool things on the other side of the gym, like pull-ups, and then I decided that I would give it a shot, and I came over, and that's how we met, and it was amazing.
I still remember you doing your. Back then, we did on ramps. So
yes.
Group on ramps. You would have been how old when you first joined us?
I think I was probably 16, 15 or 16. I think that's approximately the time that I started to come. And it was the best, like some of the best memories of my teenage years, actually.
And
Yeah.
Remind me, how long were you with us for?
I think all the way until I was at the end of my college years, I think. Probably when I was that's hard to remember, actually. I've just been in and out and still very much connected with the coastal community in different ways, and so I don't think that I don't remember the kind of the end date.
Yeah,
you know
that's
what
a
I
nice
mean?
way to put it.
Yeah.
Well, Steph, I mean, since we worked together, as a part of the group community, and we worked together one-on-one for many years after that,
Yes.
I've been watching your life unfold from a distance. We're both still in Hong Kong,
Yeah.
but you're very prominent online, and you've been doing some really, really cool stuff. And ever since starting this podcast, kind of always had your name down to be someone that I'd love to bring onto the show, and just felt like the best time to do it. And I'm really excited to dig into this conversation and hear about everything you're up to and what you're doing. So I think we should start by just some form of introduction. Would you like to take us away?
Yeah. So I always struggle with the first line of the introduction because I'm like, where do I begin? But I guess I'll say that I am currently busiest with what's currently keeping me busy, and I'm currently doing research at Mind HK as a research fellow. My PhD research looks at the relationship between language and how people make sense of mental illness and mental health recovery. So basically, I'm looking at how people might talk about these things and maybe some of the linguistic features of how they make sense of these sorts of topics that can be really complicated and difficult to talk about. And then another thing that's kind of on my radar right now is Body Banter. And Body Banter is my charity in Hong Kong that works with young people to start conversations about body image and mental health. And the vision is very much aligned with what I do in the PhD, which is just to get people to start exploring tough topics with a sense of curiosity and courage, not to shy away from things that might be unfamiliar to talk about at first, but are things that really touch us in daily life. Like our mental health is something that is in every crevice of our everyday life. And I think that the more we can find words and ways to talk about those particular experiences in our lives, the more we come to a place of connection with others as well as connection with ourselves. Yeah.
I love it. I feel like there's a lot of what you're doing right now is very interwoven. And a lot of it is around mental health being, maybe at the center of all of it. I know you do a lot of work with things like body image as well.
Yeah.
What was the story behind all of this? How did you arrive at this point in your life where these are the organizations and this is the work that you're doing?
Yeah. The passion is very personal, as I always like to say. And when I was a teen, actually, when I first arrived at Coastal, I was probably in the early stage of eating disorder recovery. And it was a really harrowing time for me, just to kind of assess where I was at in my life. Because, something that I was reading and something that I've noticed in a lot of people's stories of how they talk about mental illness is that when they come to a place of, oh my gosh, like something is not quite right, it's like this very rude interruption to their life story. It's like having a crater drop it, kind of like a meteorite landing on your planet. And you're like, oh my gosh, really destabilized. And so I think when I first came into the coastal community, and when I was in that early stage of eating disorder recovery, I was very much just like really disoriented about what was happening in my life. And finding a community where people were accepting and were reassuring of doubts that I had, of just really supportive in ways that I hadn't really, like, I couldn't really remember where my self-worth was, frankly, at the time. And coming into a community that was so invigorating was a huge part of my recovery. So I really wanted to say that because it's just so nice to be back, and to remember those days. And just to go back to why this is the work that I feel really passionately about. I think the reason why language and mental health is so important to the work I do now is because I had very little language for expressing myself back then. And I remember sitting in a therapist's office and just having nothing meaningful to say, even though the therapist was like, tell me about what you've been feeling. What's going on for you right now? And oftentimes I would just sit there either crying or just being really annoyed that I couldn't express things that were kind of lodged right here in my throat, but then just weren't able to be expressed out loud in words. So that was something that really struck me and really affected me during my recovery. And so now that I'm kind of I've practiced a little bit more telling my story, and coming to a place where I kind of have a shape of a storyline, the shape of a storyline in my head. It's something that I wish more people can kind of be acquainted with, just this tool of making sense of your story through words. That's something I'm really excited about and passionate about.
Steph, I'm interested. You know, you said when you joined Coastal, and I remember that day very, very well. You said it was the start of your recovery journey.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what were you recovering from?
Yeah. So in my teens, I think it's really interesting because when I try to think about, like what was the day that I realized that I was experiencing an eating disorder? What was the point at which recovery started? And I always try to maybe think about those timelines and milestones because people ask and they're like, oh, which day did you know? And they're all really fuzzy because there's this very stealthy onset of mental illnesses, and recovery, as I understand it, even to this day, is that it's a very continuous process, that it's more of a decision that you make every day to kind of continue a pattern of behavior that's adaptive and that's like kind to yourself, instead of, oh, like this is the checkpoint, I've reached it and I'm never going to sink again. It's more like a walking process in that way. So I think to go back to what I was kind of recovering from, or what the turning point that coming to Coastal represented for me, I think it was a different way of seeing my body. Because prior to coming to Coastal, I think I just saw my body as like a means to an end, more so as like I just want to be able to control the shape and the weight of my body so that I can feel in control. So it was just like a vessel for me to kind of practice the psychological things that were happening to me. And I was trying to make sense of all of it by controlling my body weight. But then when I came to Coastal, I think you might have said this, something along the lines of like, if you don't eat, you're never going to do a pull-up or something like that. Like, it's not going to help you do the things that you think look really cool at the gym, like doing wall balls and seeing people lift heavy things. And I was like, oh, like my body can be strong. And it doesn't have to be something that's, it's just there. It's something that can really work with me. I think that was really, really powerful for me. Yeah.
There's so many things that are coming to me just thinking about, the early days and just how our journey evolved and how you evolved along that journey. So if I'm to put this into words, is it that you were going through a time in your life where naturally your body is changing? And were you fighting that change and not wanting that change to happen the way that maybe you knew it should, and you wanted to control the situation? Is that what I'm understanding?
Definitely. And I think this is like a common storyline for people who and it's one of the reasons why eating disorders happen to people in their teens a lot frequently, because it's a time when everything is a little bit chaotic. Your body is changing in ways that you may or may not like. The social circles around you are changing as well. People are leaving to go to different places for school, for example, or like friendship circles change, and then academic stressors are getting more intense. Psychological, hormonally, the roller coaster just never stops. And so I think there were just so many factors that came together for me at the time. And I think it came to a point where I was just like, I don't know how to handle any of this. And the messaging I was getting at the time also was that if my body could change in a certain direction, all of the diet ads and before and after photos, I was like, oh, that's the answer. As long as I can get to a place where I look, or I can get as close as possible to a magazine cover model, then that's going to have all the answers to everything that I was ever doubtful about. And that was always kind of a moving image in my head, because once you get to something that maybe was the previous goal, it moves again. And that's the thing about psychological or things that happen in your mind. They kind of float away and they're just ethereal and transient, never quite stay in place.
Yeah, I mean, I can resonate with that a lot in my own journey. I would say, body image issues really were triggered in my teenage years. And for me as a guy who was a late starter, in terms of puberty. So I was seeing everyone else around me, grow taller, and I was still left behind. I had developed a complex about being the smallest kid in the year, there was one Korean guy, Andy, who was smaller than me, but me and Andy were always, front of the, and like a traumatic experience for me still to this day is being on the front row of the class photo for like 7 years.
Yeah.
And my last year of school, like being on the back row was like validation for me, but for me it was all around masculinity and wanting to be taller, wanting to be bigger, wanting to look older, and a lot of those things are still like with me today. And I don't know if they'll ever truly not be a part of me, but as you said, it's developing the tools and letting the systems and the skill sets to understand, for me, when a trigger happens and what do I do about it? How do I want to respond in that moment? Do I want to feed it like I did in my teenage years, or do I want to acknowledge it and then make a choice to maybe not? Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of reminding me of, coming back to triggers and realizing, oh, like you're a little bit more experienced each time that you come back to something that was familiar in the past. But I don't think it's I'm starting to think that it's not necessary to eliminate them completely, because it is part of our life story in many ways. And so, yeah.
What happened after you joined Coastal? Because, you kind of went on this really interesting journey. I think it's an important journey to talk about. You were Steph who just wanted to be a part of a community and learn some cool stuff. And then at some point in time, this like competitive side to you really came out where, you wanted to pursue CrossFit and compete and throw yourself in these crazy environments and situations and competitions. And then when you went to university, we were still working together. The goalpost shifted, and then I feel like there was a point in time where suddenly it was like you had clarity, and a lot of what my maybe not my take on it, and I haven't had enough time to really think about this, but it was that perhaps the relationship that you had with exercise, you were figuring things out as you went along.
Yes.
And it got to a point in time where the words you used weren't, I need to stop doing this because I have an unhealthy relationship with exercise, but it was like, I just need to stop this because I think I need to stop this. It's time for me to change what I'm doing. So would you talk me through that journey?
Yeah, that actually brings back a lot of memories, or gives me a bit more clarity also of the storyline, because, and it's interesting to hear you talk about it, because I don't think, like, even I haven't really thought about that process, but then the process. How fitting. But I think let me try to start from kind of the first instance when I came through and I was like, oh, look, cool people doing cool things. And I think that piqued my curiosity because I was thinking about like, all of a sudden I saw exercise in a different way. I think when I first came into Coastal that first day, when I saw people just like having fun while exercising and suffering a little bit, probably also, but in a really
lot
cool
those
way.
days.
A lot. It looked so cool. I just thought, oh wow, I've never seen people enjoy the process of exercising like that. And so I think for me, that was just a curiosity spark, and changed my relationship with exercise just a bit as well. Even in that first stage.
And
And
can
then,
I ask
yeah,
real quick, Steph, what
absolutely.
was your relationship, would you say, like before that with exercise?
Compulsive. Yeah, it was more so like I just have to do it because I need to tick it off my checkbox.
Yep.
It was like the thing to do when it comes to the narrative of health. It's like, eat, and healthy changed in so many different directions. Like, what does healthy eating even mean? The way I defined that changed so much throughout. I think it continues to change in many ways. But at the time, I think it was very turbulent. And whenever I would focus on one particular form of eating or exercising, I would just latch onto it and had very low flexibility as to kind of variations in eating and exercising patterns. So I would say that prior to that first day when I came into Coastal, that was probably how I would define it. Very rigid and very compulsive. And then after, I think going into the competitive stage, as you were as you were describing, I'm trying to think about what the shift was. I think probably it was just seeing people do really impressive things at the gym, and that was the environment that I was in, and I really wanted to try it. I think it was a response to curiosity once again. But yeah, I think those days were awesome and really, really fun. And also, I think afterwards, as I started to shift into, especially when I went to university, and I realized that there were other things I wanted to explore as well. There was a period of grieving because it was a big dream to be like, oh, I really want to pursue this sport in a very serious way. And then I went to university and there were other things I wanted to try out, and that was fun too. So I think that there was a piece of my identity that had to be dropped, and that's always hard.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
hard, and it's not something that happens overnight,
Yeah,
right? There's a long process of, and especially for someone like you, I think so much of your identity was attached to what you were
definitely.
doing in the gym. Certainly within our community, probably the Hong Kong CrossFit community, probably the Asian CrossFit community, to be honest, because everyone knew little Steph, and who could like lift heavy things and was like the smallest athlete on the floor, but doing just some incredible things. So you would always win crowd support because you were there taking on weights, that you had no reason to be lifting, in a sport where most people would honestly say like, how is this person out there? And it was, you were like the inspiring one of every single competition. And so, but I think, that might add pressure, and maybe not pressure, but, adds to the identity that you create for yourself.
Yeah,
And knowing when that
for
day
sure.
is perhaps realizing in that moment that maybe this actually isn't me anymore. It's like, what are you now?
Yeah, for sure. I think it was that storyline shift it was really disorienting for me, I would say, actually. And I think even when I went to university and I realized that, like, in the back of my head that I needed to let something go, I wasn't really willing to confront it or to be aware of it until, later on as I continued to walk down the path of university life, I guess.
And as a
Yeah.
coach being on the other end,
Yeah, what was it
I
like
could
for you?
see that. I could see the transition happening. I could
I'm
see,
curious to hear
yeah. So
what it was like.
the transition for me was, we had our constant conversation was about doing. It was never hard to make you do more. In fact, if I gave you an invitation to do more, you'd
Yeah.
take it immediately. That was never going to be a question.
Yeah.
So I think, the bigger challenge for me working with you was actually we need you to do less. And I think
Yes.
there was so, and I guess a lot of it was around education and trying to get you to see the impact of, perhaps the way that you ate and the way that you trained and
Yes.
how that was not really aligning with what you wanted to achieve. And what you wanted to achieve as the athlete was to be competitive, to PR your lifts, to see
Yeah.
improvement, like we all do. You put all those time and energy into the gym, we want to see progress. And when the progress wouldn't come, when we would look at it all, we'd lay everything out and be like, okay, well, what are we not doing? What are we doing really well?
Yeah.
And we'd kind of always go through the training part. Well, yeah, I think you crush in the training. You're really focused. You're never missing a session. Like, what's missing? What's missing here? At the same time, like, I definitely didn't have the language around, mental health and body image in the way that I probably do now. So that those were much harder conversations for me to have. And probably I was just a lot more rational versus empathetic and emotional back then. But yeah, I guess the transition for me was at some point, even though maybe the conversations weren't had, I was just seeing this acceptance, I guess, of
Yeah.
actually maybe I don't need to do so much. Maybe actually I can self-regulate. And I was like, oh, Steph's like, she took a rest day.
Yeah.
It's the first rest day you'd had genuine like maybe 4 years, and that for me was a big wow. Okay, that's progress, right? And then shifting of goals,
Yeah.
right?
For
It
sure.
was moving away from doing really hard things in CrossFit. You're also living a very different life. You're doing a lot of university, so sleep was starting to become less and less. You didn't have the home
So true.
comforts, so food and stuff was tough for you because you're in a dorm room and knowing you probably signed up for everything, and so time became a luxury.
Yeah.
And so we had to find a way to fit exercise and training into your daily life there. And then there was these slow, gradual letting go of doing hard things.
Yeah.
And it became more about efficiency. Like, let's just get bang for your buck things in there. Maybe I'm not going to do a competition this year. Maybe, and it was just like a very slow, which in looking back now was probably you processing everything.
Yeah.
And like having a hunch and a feeling and not knowing what to do about it, and then trying to do something about it, maybe seeing that was a positive change. And over time, it led you probably to the point where eventually, okay, it's time for me to try something different. I mean, what do you think in hearing that from me?
That's really cool to hear. I think it's helpful to hear someone else see what was happening for me, especially because as you were saying, I don't think I had the language for it, to talk about that internal shift that was happening for me. But I think the change that was happening for me in terms of exercise was that I wanted it to be part of like a complement to all the exciting things that were also simultaneously happening in my life. And I realized that, I literally just looked and I saw priorities on the board. And it was a shift in priorities, really. Just kind of seeing exercise as a different part of my life pie. Maybe taking up a slightly smaller slice, and instead seeing more things start to populate the pie chart that I was building in my life. And I think, just to contrast that with what was happening during the eating disorder, it was that a lot of the things that I enjoyed doing started to be kind of edged out by eating and exercise. And there was very little room for me to explore things. And then when I was in university, I think letting go of control in many ways, being spontaneous. Like, I remember in the early days of university, someone was like, do you want to like leave campus and just explore Boston? And I was like, no. And it was just really, I think, contrasting that with what happened at the end of university and just being able to kind of go on a whim to explore a different part of the city was a really great feeling. And looking back, I think there was a lot more room for me to explore as I started to go through university, for sure.
What does your training look like now? Is training still a part of your week, part of your life?
Definitely. And I think that's something that I take with me. I continue to take with me from my coastal days and just those early transitional moments for me, in terms of exercise, is that it's the joy of doing something in the day that's just for my mental health is very prominent. So, even if it's a day of like, when it's really packed, I will always put something in there that's maybe it's like a dance video or like, going and lifting something heavy for a bit of time that I have in my day, it will make its way into my day, and it always makes me feel like myself again. So I think that's something I take with me always. Like movement, there's something about movement that really brings something to my table.
But it
Yeah.
sounds like there isn't really an attachment to any one movement. It's just
Yeah.
movement as this overall expression of using your body.
Exactly. I think that's what that's how I would understand and kind of see the role of movement in my life now. It's something that's very much like an integration into the rest of my routine and is exciting. Like it's something I do for myself and I enjoy having in my day, as opposed to maybe, I will still prioritize having it. And it's not to say that I won't plan it, but it's something that I enjoy incorporating into my day as opposed to like I need to fit my whole day around that particular thing. So that's the way I see it now.
I love it.
Yeah.
Steph, tell me about body banter.
Another big topic. When you were saying prior to our conversation about that it's a 7-year-old company, I'm just thinking about that now. It's a little bit wild to me because to be frank, we only really started to structure things when COVID started. For most of I would say 5 years since when we first started out, we were a student club, and that was we kind of just operated on certain college campuses, online on the website, on our social media pages, and throughout my college years and during the time that I was studying, so undergrad and master's, it was kind of like an initiative, I would say. And then after, during COVID, I started to think about the potential for it to reach potentially, more communities within Hong Kong specifically. And I was thinking about setting down roots here because I knew that I would be here for a little bit longer. And so I realized I haven't even told people about what Body Banter is. Now that I've just like kind of ranted about, just reminisced about what it was at the start. But Body Banter, in a nutshell, it's a community that I started when I was in kind of maybe kind of a few years post the most severe point of my eating disorder. And I wanted to find a way to connect with other people and their stories surrounding body image and mental health. And frankly, at the start, when I first established the Body Banter website, like just, created a Squarespace site, I really just wanted to see how other people talked about this topic. Because as I was saying, I didn't really have language for my experiences. And I thought I would just kind of pick other people's brains a little bit. So it was probably, motivated mostly by that motivation of, hey, what are other people experiencing right now? And what
did that look like, Steph? Like, was it a chat forum? Was there just a space where people could just write down thoughts? What was it?
It was like, so if you can imagine, it's like a rolling blog post, a rolling blog page. So there were videos and there were blog posts and there were, someone made a stop motion video, someone did a dance video. So it was just a really cool experience of seeing how everyone or different people would make sense of their experiences with body image or express that in different mediums. So I just invited people to, friends and friends of friends to share, using just the very basic prompt of, tell me about your experiences with body image. And then people would come in with kind of spoken word or, just like talking about their experiences. And then some people would write about it. Some people would draw about it. Some people would write poems. And it was just really cool to see, how people expressed those ideas. So that was how it was like the beginning of Body Banter.
And where's it evolved to now?
Now we have a mixture of all of the things that kind of made us at the start as well. So we have, I'll speak a little bit to, what we currently do and where I see it going, I think will be exciting as well. But yeah, so we have 2 mentorship programs that we work with. We work with 15 to 25-year-olds. So that's kind of high school to college age students. And previously we did more work internationally. So because I had studied abroad, we had some groups in the US and in the UK as well, but now more focused with Hong Kong students and Hong Kong youth. But they're the 2 mentorship programs. The first one is called the Banter Ambassador Program. So it's the ambassador program that we have. And it's essentially a 5 5-week program where we get young people to essentially explore the topic of body image with our guidance. So they start off and maybe they identify an issue that they're really interested in. So what is body positivity? What is body acceptance? What's the relationship between anime and body image? So things like things that are really pertinent to their lives and something that really they've been interested in exploring. And then we guide them through a process of learning how to express those types of ideas in what we call like a small mini projects throughout the program. So they start off by identifying why they're there. Why are you a body image advocate? Why is it something that means something to you? So aligning that with their values and their mission. And then they create something like a resource for the community. So it can be a series of reels, an Instagram swipe post. If they wanted to, they could create an event as well. So they could create a panel discussion or a forum about that topic. So it's really up to them as to what they want to do with that particular interest that they have. But it's kind of guided by our team to make sure that they can created with a certain framework as well, and that they're sending out a message that's supportive for the community members as well. So that's our Banter Ambassador program. And then we have our Conversation Communities program. So that's our program where we work with student leaders to create discussion groups at their schools. And this one is kind of a bit more of a free, or they take initiative for many of the things that they do on their campuses, because we can't kind of like monitor all of the things that happen on school campuses because we have a pretty small team right now. But we provide guidance for them to, for example, if they have issues with like what should I talk about during our discussions? How do we collaborate with other school groups to, let's say they want to talk about culture and body image, then we might suggest some ideas for how they can collaborate with a culture club on their school campuses to create a discussion on that. So that's more of a mentorship for student leaders who will then take the initiative to establish these kind of events and discussions at their schools on their own accord. So that's one of my favorite things to watch blossom because they're so creative. Young people really just have so many wise ideas in their heads, and with the proliferation of social media as well, it makes the possibilities endless, for them to share those ideas online, to create Instagram lives, and things like that. So I spoke for a long time.
You're the star of the show right now, Steph. How has that been, coming into the space, talking about mental health and body image in a country like Hong Kong? So for listeners who aren't based in Hong Kong, maybe this is harder to understand, but, I think culturally we have a lot of things, stereotypical qualities, I should say, about the Hong Kong people that I would say that has probably kept us behind as a nation, as a country, in terms of having conversations around mental health, especially, but body image as well. So what have some of the challenges been for you? An organization in Hong Kong, and I think we should probably allude to what some of the challenges are. I think things like vulnerability, things like admitting that you need help.
Oh my gosh.
It's something
So
you
true.
talked about in your TED talk, which was feeling like we're a burden to other people and not wanting to burden others.
Yeah.
Impatient, always in a rush, the busy city. How has it been navigating those things, on subjects like body image and mental health?
Yeah. So this is so interesting to me because even as I do research on it, I recognize those traits in myself. And I'll often have these moments of clarity in the research, but also I'll be like, oh my gosh, this just happened to me this morning, or I'll practice things that I've just kind of gleaned in the research in my daily life. So I'll elaborate a bit on that. But I think I'll share an anecdote to really just like to talk a little bit to those 2 points of like impatience as well as feeling like you could be a burden. I think something that I noticed is that, if you're walking through like a busy part of the city, let's say Central, and you see someone that you're passing by someone or just like you want to say hi to them, it's hard to say, oh, how are you doing? Or, you don't really expect a response from that person back you're like, oh, how are you? And they're like, good. And I think most people would say good back because it's quite difficult to kind of retrieve things that are kind of deeply rooted in your heart in that moment. But I do think that it speaks to why a lot of people might be nervous to disclose, or it's a habit that we have, that we kind of rush past people, and the perception in our heads is that no one has time to listen to things that are really going on for me. And even if this person is really asking me how I'm doing, why the heck would I just like tell them? Would they really listen? There's a fear of that. It's kind of like sitting on a diving board, and that moment before you jump into the water, and you're like, will this person really listen to me? And if they did listen to me, would I have the words to express more or to elaborate on my experience? So yeah, I think that's one of the, just the mentality. That's one part of the challenge. And another thing that I've noticed, and this comes from my experiences of sitting in ambassador training sessions, which I do at Mind Hong Kong. And this is part of our More Than a Label anti-stigma campaign that works with people with lived experiences to talk about their stories of mental health recovery. And I work with groups that speak English, and then groups that speak Cantonese. And if you live in Hong Kong, you'll know that those lines aren't so clear-cut. Because in the Cantonese group, there will be people who speak Cantonese, but also English. And then in the English group, there will be people who are potentially, they speak English, but then they also speak Cantonese. And so there's like a bilingual mix there. So it's not a clean-cut category. But what I've noticed is that in the Cantonese category, people will talk about how they've never actually talked about mental health in Cantonese before. Like, mental illness is just not something that people have kind of really expressed in that particular language that they speak. And it's not because there's no vocabulary for those particular words. There are words for the words depression, anxiety, mental illness, but people don't use those terms and often will switch into English when they mention those terms. So it'll sound something like 我之前有 anxiety. 我被 diagnosed 有 depression. So it's like there'll be these pops of English words that just really show that there's a discomfort and an unfamiliarity potentially when it comes to those specific types of those particular terms. That's not due to the fact that there aren't kind of linguistic equivalents in the Cantonese language. So that's just really interesting to me.
And do you is a big part of that the fact that the conversations aren't happening, and therefore there isn't this like sharing and learning from one another that occurs when you're having those conversations? Is that what's holding back conversations in Cantonese about mental health? What do you think? What is it?
My hypothesis at the moment is still something I'm trying to figure out, because it probably has many different explanations for why it's the case. But my hunch is that it has to do with potentially those. I always think about it as it's those grooves are not greased. People haven't kind of worked the conversational framework that way before. So when you say something like, I'm just going to think about another example of even like saying. I'm saying, are you okay?
Listeners, our content guy Alex just tripped over something. He does this at least once a podcast.
I was like, oh my god. Okay, let me try to fish back my stream of thought.
You're coming back to an example.
Yes. Even something as simple as saying I love you in Cantonese. I realized the other day when I was trying to say to my grandmother, like, I always say I love you. I just say I love you in English. But then the other day I was trying to I was like, oh, I'm going to give it a shot and say the awkward ngõ ngõi nei in Cantonese. And it's the same, the kind of the meaning of those two terms are exactly the same. There's absolutely no difference. Like, semantically, they're exactly the same. But for me, in that moment, even in that simple instance, I was like, that feels so awkward to say for reasons I can't really. It's because I just haven't practiced saying ngõ ngõi nei often enough to someone. So I think that kind of reflects back or kind of parallels the reasons why mental health terms potentially might not be used in conversations so much, just because people don't frequently pop them into conversations, or they're not exercised.
And is that deeply rooted in our culture?
I'm trying to think about. I think this is something I still need to really dig into. It might not even just be a. I'm thinking about whether not something I've been like chewing on is that not everything is rooted in cultural explanations. There could just be something to do with like kind of linguistic patterns. Just the ways that it might not even be linked to stigma or mental health stigma or reluctance to use those words. It could be none of those things. It could be a way of changing the patterns of how you speak so that you can express a certain type of emotion. Discomfort, for example. If you are uncomfortable, you might use different linguistic markers like stammering, or you might like have a silent, like a sudden silence, a short silence before you say something. You might have a short inhalation before you talk. You might have, an emotional voice when you talk. So all of these are just features of how we talk, but maybe switching into a different language is just one of those features. So that's something I'm also sitting on and chewing on. It's possible.
What else are you chewing on with your research? What interesting things are you finding?
I think something I'm interested in my research is also just generally how we make sense of mental illness and how it shapes in our heads as people living in Hong Kong. Because I've noticed that it's definitely not a black and white picture. It's not that every, I think there's a stereotypical assumption that most people in Hong Kong have stigmatizing assumptions toward people with mental illness, or that's what the big survey data shows. It's like a lot of people in Hong Kong would discriminate or have discriminatory attitudes toward people with mental illness. But there's nuance to that. I'm really interested to see what those nuances are, because let's say if you asked someone in a conversation, like, what did you think of, I don't know, what do you think of mental health? Or would you bring a family member to a doctor if they were experiencing a mental health problem? It would probably be very different from asking them, like, would you trust someone with a mental, like in those very standardized survey questions that can only capture a certain type of context or sentiment? Like, would you trust someone with a mental illness to take care of your baby? Like, that's one of the types of questions you might get asked in a standardized survey. And that just doesn't capture the everyday nuance of how people experience mental health and mental illness in their daily lives. So that's what I'm interested in. Like, there is a bigger picture for sure. And it's not to say that anti-stigma initiatives at the broader level aren't important, but it is to say that there's, at the individual level, there's a lot more to like unpack and dig out as well.
Yeah, I think, and I'm guilty of falling into this group when I first started hearing the term mental health. And I would just see mental health not as a continuum or a spectrum, but it would just be you're either mentally healthy or you're mentally unhealthy. And there was nothing in between. And in my understanding of it was that you were only mentally unhealthy if you had, in my head, would be a serious problem, which in my head meant that you're going to the doctor and you're receiving medication or you're receiving special treatment to fix said mental illness. Can you allude to that? Because I think that's an important definition that we have to talk about, which is like when we talk about mental health, like what actually are we? What are we referring to?
Yeah, that's also such an interesting question to chew on because, and this is going to sound really like wishy-washy, like it depends.
Always a good answer in my eyes.
But it's really what we see in people's lived experiences or their stories when they talk about that continuum of mental health and mental illness. It's like, I was in a panel discussion a couple of days ago, last week, and I was talking to some ambassadors from our More Than a Label campaign about what recovery meant to them, and everyone had a different analogy to talk about how that process was like. And it's very close to it's kind of like, having triggers and walking along a continuous journey. So someone was saying that it's like seeing footprints in the sand and looking back and seeing that you've walked a journey that was meaningful to you. And, perhaps there were some places where you tripped up, but, you are walking in, you see those footprints and you're learning from that process. And then someone else said that another person was also saying that it's like walking on a path and sometimes walking forwards and sometimes walking backwards and sometimes walking sideways, but still seeing, turning back and seeing that you've walked a long way. And there was a third person who was saying that, what was it? It's like mental health recovery is like, seeing different ways of getting fertilizer as a plant. Or like, you are nourishing yourself with different types of new stimulations in your life as you're kind of walking along that path of recovery. So I wanted to bring that up because I think it really does show how people make sense of what mental health is, because that's going to differ based on whether you had a mental illness in the past, whether you're in recovery from a mental illness, or whether you have never had a mental illness or diagnosed mental illness in the past, and maybe you've had, sprinkles of mental health distress throughout your life. Because I think most, if not all, people have had, even if they haven't had a diagnosable mental illness, they'll, because of things like COVID and the restrictions we went through, I think many people had experiences of mental distress that they've never experienced or never confronted in the same way as they did during COVID. So to kind of wrap up and say, or like to come to the point of like, how would I think about how would I understand mental health now? I think it really does depend on, it's a daily process of trying to define what is going to be suitable for you that day. What is something that's going to, I was looking at your 20 Mad shirt. And maybe it's going out for a walk. Maybe it's seeing the sun. Maybe it's, taking a nap on that day when you're particularly tired. It's what's suited to you that day. And, taking into account your previous experiences as well. So it's more so of a continuum of what keeps you well and practices and habits, as opposed to a destination of like, I'm in a place that is mentally healthy. And that's what
I think I think it's very beautiful, but I think that's what makes it so hard to understand.
it is.
Because I think a natural comparison that people make when they talk about mental health is probably going to be physical health.
Yeah, for
Right.
sure.
So it's like we see the mental and the physical as like the yin and yang. It's like the two things that are ultimately make up like our health. When we talk about physical health, it's very quantifiable in many ways.
Absolutely.
Right. So if we're talking about, okay, let's talk about a gym. Like, how strong are you? How aerobically fit are you? How flexible are you?
Yeah.
And then you go to the doctors and you go for a physical health checkup, and it's like, what's your cholesterol levels? What's your blood pressure? And you have these very tangible ways to almost quantify your physical health.
Yeah.
Which makes
absolutely.
it very easy to understand, comprehend, and communicate. But I think in the mental health space, we don't have those things really. And I think that is a barrier that's always going to make it, at least right now, because physical health has been talked about for centuries and centuries and years, as has mental health. But it's really kind of coming into the fray, I think, more recently, where conversations are, it's not voodoo anymore, or it's not, it doesn't have the stigma around it that it used to, because of a lack of understanding. So, and what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's something that contributes to making it something that is quite hard to understand and wrap your head around?
Definitely. I think the unpredictability of what mental health and mental illness mean, or kind of the continuum of it, the lack of very concrete markers, makes a lot of people feel apprehensive toward people with mental health problems and mental illness, because it's like, oh, I never know what's going on, or there's an air of unpredictability or fear or unfamiliarity when it comes to that. But yeah, I think there isn't perhaps the way to address stigma in society, the way I understand it now, is less to make or wrap up the concept of mental health and mental illness in neater terms, because that's never going to be possible. And instead, the way I see forward is the storytelling and getting people to see that diversity and to understand that that is part of the human experience, which is why those conversations matter so much. Just having people talk to others and see themselves in others as well. Of like lending language to each other, giving people words and vocabulary to talk about their own experiences and know that everyone's a little bit messy on the inside also. It's like recognizing and seeing the other person. That's the way I
You just mentioned the term lending language,
Yes,
which is
my favorite.
bringing me back to your TED talk. And you did a TED talk, which I think firstly is awesome. Tell us about that story. How did you end up doing a TED talk?
um, wow. I'm trying to retrieve the memories now.
And it was an
I
amazing
think
TED talk, by the way,
I
guys.
think
Those listening, you need to give us a listen. I'll include it in the show notes. But it was called 3 Reasons Your Mental Health Story is Like a Disco Ball.
yes.
So yeah, tell us that story.
I think you might know more about the TED Talk than I than I do now because my memory is like escaping me. But wait, I'm trying to also retrieve my train of thought. Um, where should I start?
Well, the disco ball analogy, firstly,
Hmm.
because I think
Yeah.
in the way that you presented, um, you presented at the TED talk, the disco ball was a perfect analogy for the
Hmm.
3 points that you really raised.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? Is that something that did you create that? Is that something that, yeah, you're nodding your head like yes?
Yes. I was trying to bring together the points that I wanted to bring across in a way that wouldn't be kind of really dry and not fun to listen to. So I just
Tell
imagined.
us about those 3 points.
Yeah. So the first point is that we all know what disco balls look like, hopefully. And they have lots of shards of glass that make up this amazing thing that then produces light that kind of reaches every corner of the room. And it is those particular kind of broken pieces of the disco ball that make it exude that light. And I think that really brought home the point that is, we all have those shards of glass that make up our experiences that are messy and potentially we feel in fear that other people won't understand. But that might be the thing that reaches other people. It's going to shine to that, like the farthest corner of the room, and make that person feel included. So that is tied to the lending language piece of when we share our stories, we're giving other people not just the specific vocabulary words, but also the conversational frameworks to make sense of what they might be experiencing. So I think many of us have the experience of hearing someone's story or reading someone's story and being like, oh, that's me too. Or that word is exactly what kind of captures my experience. So that's the first point about the disco ball.
And I want to just say there, I love the term lending language because I refer to this a lot, but I've never had a succinct way to say why I think vulnerability is so powerful. But one of those ways is the fact that every time I share something that I'm going through with a person or a group, I level up because my ability to communicate what I'm experiencing improves just by means of saying it. And if by me sharing it, it sparks a conversation with someone who is then sharing back, I level up because I'm learning from the way that they share their story. And when I heard the term lending language, I was like, that's exactly what's happening. And that's exactly why I have gravitated towards it so much. And it's that lending of language and that conversation that actually brings people together. And vulnerability for me was very scary because I thought vulnerability would actually push me apart.
Yeah. I think that's what it feels like at the start too, because when you tell someone something that's, deeply personal often, it feels like a breaking apart of some part of you, whether it's a belief you held about yourself or, I think it's very apt to describe, it's vulnerability is a really scary idea. And I think, yeah, like definitely, I really appreciate you sharing that.
And I think being vulnerable to the wrong person at the wrong time,
That's all. Definitely.
can make matters worse sometimes. So I think it's really important to not say that, just go out there and share what you're feeling whenever you feel like to anyone who's around who's willing to listen. Because I think there is just as much as there's a skill at being vulnerable and sharing vulnerability, there is a skill in acknowledging vulnerability and hearing vulnerability.
Definitely. And I'm just going to, can I expand upon that a bit?
Yeah, please.
It reminds me of something that we kind of really hone in when we're talking to our ambassadors during the training programs, which is that sharing your story as part of an anti-stigma program is not the same as therapy. And it's, in that space when we're doing the training programs, we encourage everyone to share openly. And during the training programs, it's a very safe space where there will be, big expressions of emotion. But, when we start to craft that story to be shareable at a public event, we do kind of emphasize that it's important to maintain those emotional boundaries, to hone in on 1 to 3 messages that you really want to share in that particular session, and to not kind of, really give all of it. Like, you are not accountable to the audience to give all the details of your story. And that's not the point of the anti-stigma sharing or that public sharing activity. So that's really interesting, because there are appropriate levels of vulnerability in different circumstances. And yeah, whether you're sharing in a public event or with one person, a couple of people, it's you have to assess the level of disclosure that you can, that you're ready for, as well as that audience is ready for, I think.
Yeah. And I think the latter is really important, because I've certainly been in a position many times where maybe someone has felt that I'm a safe space where they want to share, and I think the term is like emotional dumping. But it's basically where someone just comes and like lays everything on you there and then, right? And I think often they haven't asked if it can be done, which sometimes can. I remember just with my partner, we started talking about this, and I would ask sometimes, like, "Hey, I'm going through something. Would you be okay if I shared it with you?" And she was like, "Why do you have to make it so formal? Like, why don't you just share it with me? Like, that's what partners do." And I was like, "Well, maybe you've had a tough day and you're not ready to hear what I'm about to tell you, because there is an emotional weight to often what we say, especially with vulnerability."
Yeah.
And as much as you might be a great listener who's able to just compartmentalize and just listen, like, often that's going to infiltrate into you as well. And so, yeah, something that I've learned to do is, to almost ask for permission, and willingness to hear and listen first, before I start sharing. And if I have that invitation, then someone's, they welcome me in, and they're probably not going to experience that emotional dumping.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
That's a great practice. I think I think it goes in the opposite direction as well. Like, when you're open to hearing someone, or you kind of have the emotional capacity. For me, I will say to I'll sometimes message my friends and be like, "I know you're going through a tough time. I have a lot of space right now. So if there's something you'd like to share, I've got you." So, like, kind of on the end of the side of the listener, being very communicative with the other person, and this does take knowing that the other person is going through a tough time, of course. But I think it really speaks to that communication that needs to go on between two people who are at that level of disclosure and are there for each other. You still have to, or I think it's a great practice to communicate clearly that you have the capacity today or not. So I think that's awesome.
Love it. I'm going to go back to your disco ball.
Yes. Wait, I actually forgot the 2 points.
That's okay.
Can you remind me?
Yeah. So, you talked about the fragmented pieces of our stories are what help us to connect with others. I love that. And I think there's 2 parts to that. It's our fragmented stories. And I love the idea that mental health it's inclusive of everyone, right? And you used an analogy of being on the dance floor, and the disco ball is not only shining to the person who's confident, who's in the middle of the floor, who's waving their arms around like a lunatic, and you've got the person in the corner who's holding their drink, kind of not feeling comfortable enough to get on the dance floor, and it's welcoming that person as well. And I love that. But the idea of reflecting back, I like that. Could you tell us about that? So basically, how telling our mental health stories empower both the teller and the listener.
Yes, this is, I think this is so tied to my experiences as well. On both ends, reading, I remember in early eating disorder recovery, I would read a lot and listen a lot to people's experiences, because I wanted to be able to kind of see myself in their stories as well, and to it's the lending language piece again of taking other people's nuggets of knowledge and bringing it into crafting my storyline. So from the the end of the listener or the receiver of the stories, you're kind of seeing yourself in the fragments of another person's disco ball. And then when you share, so, in the process of sometimes when I share my story in workshops with young people, with people of any age, really, and you see the way that their eyes light up to a certain piece of your story, that moment that you
Yeah,
get
you get the nods,
the
like
nods,
the nods and eyes open, like that's me.
the people
Yeah.
resonating, and that's kind of my marker for knowing that my disco ball has reflected the light in the direction that I'm intending it to. It's permission. It's permission to explore a certain piece of your story. I think when that disco ball shines your way, or when you hear someone's story and you're like, "That's it. That's how I express this like really deep moment that I hadn't previously really thought about." And then that's the point I was trying to make there.
Yeah, I love it. There's something else you said, which is, in conversation and sharing, we stimulate we stimulate imagination. We stimulate imagination for us to then start exploring ourselves. But I think something you said twice on the TED Talk, which I picked out, was when we're ready.
Yes.
And I think that's a really important point to make.
Thank you for picking that out. That was one of the things that I think I really wanted to carry and kind of really communicate throughout the talk, which was that, and it goes back to the vulnerability aspect that we were talking about. It's, you may see yourself in someone else's story and recognize and resonate with lots of different points, but it takes time for us to come up with our version of what we've reflected and resonated with. And oftentimes, I'll see people in the audience nodding, or someone will come up to me after a talk and say, that was really powerful. And I don't really know where I'm going with my story yet, but I just wanted you to know that that was something that changed my mind. And at that point, the person is not yet, perhaps ready to tell me their story or to construct something that is shareable with other people, but it gets those gears turning and gives them the language and perhaps the framework for them to start writing the story that they have. And then when they're ready, they will naturally have that. They're like, oh, someone already talked about this. I can be ready, and I will be ready when I am. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the power of conversation is that without the conversation, someone may never get to that point of feeling ready.
Exactly.
And I think something that I think about is that we all have baggage. We all have trauma of some sort. We all have things that have happened in our past that we're carrying with us today. And
100%.
without the conversation, it almost saddens me that some people can live a whole life holding all of that in and never expressing it, or never trying to understand it, or never to cultivate the tools to be able to deal with it.
Absolutely.
And that saddens me. And a part of me feels very grateful to have, had this life intervention that allowed me to start exploring this stuff, and to now have language around it, to now have met some amazing people who are also going through similar things, and to now have an amazing toolbox of things that have allowed me to improve my relationship with all the things and improve ultimately myself. And it honestly saddens me thinking that people may never experience that. And remembering what life was like when I held all that baggage and didn't know what to do with it,
Yeah.
and it's not a nice place to be, really, right? There's a lot of darkness, especially often like when those things are triggered, or when you're by yourself and alone.
Yeah.
And part of my inspiration of why I want to share is because I don't want others to experience that. And I want others to feel the freedom of what it feels like when you can talk about this stuff and understand it and connect the dots as to why you are the way you are and what you can do about it.
Your disco ball is shining, Coach Ed, to the darkest corner of the room. And people are, I think that's exactly it, of kind of sharing your story so that other people know that they're not alone, and also that it's something that can be addressed. I'm sure people listen to a story that you tell and then are like, oh, I didn't know that was something that someone had previously experienced and got over. People don't see a potential ending to a story or a struggle that they're going through, I think, often. And what storytelling does, or having a conversation does, is shows them a possible way that they could resolve or at least cope with something that they're going through. So
Yes.
that's
And I feel like every time I share it, regardless of the medium or the platform, whether it's Instagram, whether it's on the podcast, whether it's in a conversation, often the things we're sharing in vulnerability are the deepest, darkest secrets or the traumas or the baggage that's been with you for a long time. And every time I share it, it's lighter.
Yes.
You don't carry the weight as much. And that for me is a selfish benefit that I get from sharing it, like genuinely.
Yeah.
And then the non-selfish benefit is that, well, I hope this can inspire someone else and help someone else along their way, which is why I'm always going to gravitate towards it.
Yeah.
It's like, it's a win-win in my eyes. Why wouldn't I?
Yeah.
And I get asked that question a lot. It's like, oh, you share a lot. Like, why do you share so much? And I'm like, well, this is why.
Yeah, absolutely. Has benefits on both ends.
Yeah.
And that's how I see it that way as well.
Steph, what does the future hold for you?
Another big question.
You're halfway through a PhD right now, and you are studying the relationship between language and mental health. Do you have a vision for yourself? Can you see what you might be doing in the future or what you want to be doing?
Yeah, I think maybe the short-term future, I have an inkling of, I think now I have an inkling of what I'm passionate about, but the specific life path that comes afterwards is very open. And I think this was something, or my vision for the future is very much informed by things that I learned during COVID, actually, because COVID messed up my plans majorly. I had envisioned that I would stay in the US after my master's, and I thought I would practice there as a therapist for a while before coming back to Hong Kong and then, maybe setting up a private practice or just being in the field of a practicing psychologist or a practicing therapist. And that was what I always thought I would do post-graduation. And then COVID was like, nope, you're coming back to Hong Kong middle of your master's. And so I had a big kind of life interruption there as well. And it messed up, or it kind of broke my, the vision that I had for what I would be doing in maybe the next 10 years. And then the PhD was a surprising drop from the sky. I remember getting the kind of the newsletter from MindHK, and it was like, we're recruiting a PhD student for the anti-stigma program. And I was like, that's perfect. It's everything I want to do. And so since then, I've been kind of keeping my my eyes open and like welcoming different things in coming to me in life. And right now, I just know that it's very interesting to me that language and mental health are so interlinked. The ways we express ourselves, the ways our cultural backgrounds and our linguistic repertoires really just influence the ways that we make sense of these topics. That's all I kind of know, but that is kind of enough for me.
As to where that takes you,
yeah,
we shall see.
we shall see. Yeah, I'm excited for it.
Steph, we have a bit of a closing tradition on this podcast. You didn't need to prepare for this at all. And I also noticed you haven't used your notepad once.
I wrote fragments and dance floor.
Oh, nice. Steph, if you were to talk us through your perfect day, what would it look like?
Wow, that's such a good question. I think it would be waking up at sunrise, going outdoors and taking a walk and not in Hong Kong humidity. So maybe sometime in October, like imagine the world in forever October, November weather and the sunrise, right? Going outdoors, taking a walk, making myself breakfast, writing for a couple of hours, going for a dance class or some kind of really fun, kind of groovy movement, getting lunch with a friend. I really like meetings because it's like another way to have conversations, but about things that are really exciting, projects that are happening. And then probably, getting dinner with my family. That would be the perfect day, like the best day ever.
Love it. I feel like you'd actually thought about that question before in the way that you were so regimented and just knew exactly what it would look like. But maybe my question is like, how far off is that from what life looks like right now?
That's actually kind of quite close to what I would have in, yeah, like I try my best to have as many of those days as I can.
Awesome.
And yeah, the reason why it was so clear was because that's what my Google Calendar looks like on days where I'm like, that was a very regular but amazing day. So yeah.
I love it. Steph,
Do you have a response for that?
no, I mean, I
As
had,
in,
I,
do you have a day, a perfect day in your head? Do you answer this
yeah,
too much on
no,
podcast?
I mean, I do. I mean, you know why I love the question? Um, because I guess the people that I invite onto this podcast, I clearly have some form of connection to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is something that's pulling me to have this person be on the show, and maybe that's like I feel connected in our values. I feel connected in our interests. Those are normally probably the two things that I feel connected with, and therefore it's no surprise that when I ask people what their perfect day looks like, there are so many similarities within all the guests that run consistent, and some of those similarities are waking at the sunset.
Yeah. Sunrise.
Sunrise. Sorry, that's definitely not waking at sunset. I haven't had anyone say that yet. Waking at sunrise,
Yeah.
getting outside straight away in nature and like
Mm.
walking or doing something in nature. Movement.
Mm-hmm.
Often people have their work be a part of their day, and I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
Work would be a part of my day.
Mm-hmm.
Connection with friends,
Yeah.
food,
Amazing.
family,
Yes.
um, and generally like early bedtimes.
And ending with a good book. That's really important as well.
Nice.
Or a podcast. Just something that's like nutrients for the brain, but in a chill way.
Yeah, and I guess the last similarity that I see is how often people's ideal day is something that very closely resembles what the day looks like right now.
Yeah.
And so people are manifesting their ideal lives and they're creating it, and I love that. And I would say when I talk about my ideal day, I pretty much have that. It's pretty damn amazing every
Yeah.
single day.
I love that. So cool.
Steph, where can people find out more about you? Where can they get in contact?
You can find me on my Instagram. I do fun things on Instagram, like reels where I dance with my dad.
I enjoy those reels.
They're so fun.
They're good.
I'm at _ the mighty munchkin _. There is an imposter that has 2 underscores, so please don't click on that. You can tell by the number of posts. I have many more. And then you can find us at Body Banter, at Body Banter, as well on Instagram. And then our website is www.bodybanter.com.
Awesome, Steph. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure reconnecting with you, and having you on this podcast, but having you back here at Coastal.
The coolest.
I'm going to be watching your story, very closely because I think you're doing some really amazing things. So thank you so much for creating the time and the energy to share everything with us. And until next time.
Thanks so much for having me. It's so fun. Shout out to Alex, who's behind the camera.
Thank you, Steph.